The warm sun hung lazily over Los Angeles, casting golden light over the busy streets below. Inside a bustling McDonald's on the corner of a crowded avenue, the laughter of children echoed through the air, blending with the hum of conversations and the sizzling sound of fries hitting the fryer. It was just another ordinary afternoon, a perfect scene of normalcy amidst the chaotic pulse of city life. Keanu Reeves, wearing his signature simple black t-shirt and sunglasses, sat quietly at a corner booth, his eyes lost in thought as he sipped his drink. He had just finished a charity event, one of the many causes close to his heart, and now, he sought solace in the simple pleasure of a quiet meal away from the flashing cameras and prying eyes. There was nothing extraordinary about this moment, nothing that suggested the storm that was about to break. Keanu was content, lost in the peaceful mundanity of it all, but then, something caught his eye. A small, blond boy, no older than 5, kept glancing over at him from a nearby table. The boy's wide eyes were locked on Keanu, his gaze unwavering, filled with something Keanu couldn't quite place: fear, curiosity, or something else entirely. The boy sat with his back to Keanu, but Keanu could feel the weight of his stare, piercing through the quiet buzz of the restaurant. Keanu's instinct kicked in, but he dismissed it, thinking it was just a child fascinated by seeing a famous actor in a public place. The boy's actions, however, seemed more than innocent. He fidgeted nervously, clutching a toy car in his hands, the edges chipped and worn, as if it had seen better days. But it was more than just a toy to him, it was the only thing he seemed to have in this vast world. Keanu tried to ignore the boy's gaze and return to his meal, but the boy's presence remained like a shadow. The boy seemed to gather courage, his small hands gripping the car tightly as if preparing for something. Then, without warning, he slid off his chair and began walking towards Keanu's table. There was no hesitation in his movement, only a quiet determination that made Keanu's heart beat faster. The boy stopped beside Keanu's table, standing there for a moment as if measuring his next move. His eyes locked with Keanu's, wide with something unsaid, something urgent. Keanu, sensing the tension in the air, raised an eyebrow and gave him a polite, encouraging smile. The boy, trembling slightly, leaned in close, his voice a whisper so soft that Keanu had to strain to hear. "He hurt my mom, can you help us?" The words came out in a rush, barely audible, but they hit Keanu like a freight train. Keanu's stomach lurched. His calm demeanor faltered for just a split second as the gravity of the boy's words sank in. The soft, trembling voice of the child was laced with fear, and for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt a chill creep up his spine. The boy glanced nervously over his shoulder, his small frame stiffening as he checked to make sure no one was watching. But it was too late. The man sitting at the table behind the boy had noticed. His piercing gaze met Keanu's, and Keanu instantly recognized the danger in the coldness of his stare. The man stood up slowly, adjusting his suit as he made his way toward the boy and Keanu's table. Every step he took was deliberate, calculated. There was no rush in his movements, only a predatory calm that sent a shiver down Keanu's spine. As he reached the table, the man gave a tight smile, one that never reached his eyes. "Sorry about this," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "Ethan can be a bit overly curious sometimes. I hope he hasn't bothered you." Keanu remained silent, watching the man with a sharp eye. Something wasn't right. The way the man's voice wavered ever so slightly, the way his eyes darted back and forth, told Keanu everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was something much darker. And Keanu, without thinking, shifted his body to position himself between the man and the boy. The air around them seemed to thicken. The bustling sounds of the restaurant faded into the background as the two men locked eyes. Keanu didn't know it yet, but this quiet moment was the beginning of something far more dangerous than he had ever expected. The calm before the storm was over. Keanu stood perfectly still, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man before him. The stranger's confident demeanor was unsettling, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. The boy, Ethan, remained frozen beside Keanu, his little hand still clutching the broken toy car with white knuckles. Keanu could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the entire world had paused for a moment to witness what was about to unfold. The man's smile remained tight, barely masking the threat beneath. "It's time to go, Ethan," he said, his voice carrying a chilling undertone that made the hairs on the back of Keanu's neck stand up. He reached forward, extending a hand towards the boy, but Ethan flinched, taking a small step back. Keanu's instincts flared. He could sense the danger in the way the man moved, the control he exerted over the child. There was no love, no care, just cold authority. The silence stretched on, the hum of the restaurant's bustle now distant, muffled by the weight of the moment. Keanu's heart raced, but he kept his composure, his mind sharp. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons lingering, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Every glance was a silent question, but Keanu wasn't sure if anyone truly understood what was at stake. "Is everything all right here?" a waitress asked, stepping up to their table with a tray in her hands. Her presence seemed to shatter the moment of stillness, though she wasn't quite sure what was happening either. She looked at the man, then at Keanu, and finally, her gaze fell to the trembling child. The man turned towards her, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Yes, everything is fine," he snapped, his voice a little too harsh. "Just some childish behavior. Nothing to worry about." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, clearly trying to mask the discomfort rising within him. Keanu, unfazed, kept his focus on the boy. Ethan was still hesitant, clearly scared, but there was something in his eyes that told Keanu the boy wasn't just afraid of his father. Ethan was scared of something much darker, something deeper. Keanu could see it now, the vulnerability in his stance, the uncertainty in his small, frightened face. Ethan wasn't just being a child, he was in danger. Without breaking eye contact with the man, Keanu smiled gently at the boy. "Ethan, it's okay. You don't have to go anywhere with him." His voice was calm but firm, a quiet anchor in the storm that was threatening to break loose. The man's expression shifted immediately, his facade slipping for just a moment. The underlying threat became more palpable, his fingers twitching at his side, as if he were waiting for some signal to escalate. But Keanu wasn't backing down. "This isn't just a toy, is it, Ethan?" Keanu continued, his gaze still soft but unyielding. "You're not just scared of losing your car. You're scared of something else." Ethan's eyes flicked to his father, and for the briefest moment, Keanu saw something crack, a flicker of hope. It was as if the boy had finally realized that someone, anyone, might be on his side. The man's composure was starting to crack as well, his smile faltering, his patience thinning. "You need to mind your own business," he growled, stepping closer to Keanu, his voice now a low, dangerous whisper. "This doesn't concern you." But Keanu wasn't afraid. He stood his ground, his calm demeanor never wavering. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only the man could hear, "I think it does now." Before the man could respond, Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with a fluid motion, as if he had been preparing for this moment. He didn't waste time with hesitation, he tapped the screen, his fingers swift, sending a silent message to the one person who could help. His heart pounded in his chest as he typed, but he kept his face impassive, as if nothing unusual was happening. The waitress, still standing there, glanced nervously between the two men, sensing the danger but unsure of what to do. She glanced at Keanu, then at the man, and took a hesitant step back. Her instincts were telling her this wasn't a normal situation, that the tension between these two wasn't something she could diffuse with a polite smile or a tray of drinks. The man seemed to notice her discomfort, his gaze snapping to hers with a hint of annoyance. But it was clear now, his control was slipping. "I think you should leave," the man said through gritted teeth, his voice laced with a threat that hung in the air like smoke. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, positioning himself between Ethan and the man, his posture protective but calm. He met the man's gaze with unwavering intensity, his voice steady but filled with an authority that came from years of dealing with far worse situations. "You can't take him," Keanu said simply. "Not without facing consequences." The man's face twisted in a mix of anger and frustration. He took a step back, reevaluating the situation. His fingers curled into a fist, but he didn't make another move. The waitress took another step back, and for the first time, the man looked uncertain. The balance had shifted. It wasn't just him against a child anymore. And in that brief moment of hesitation, Keanu knew what had to be done. He couldn't let this man take Ethan. He wouldn't. He had already made the call, and now, the cavalry was on its way. Ethan looked up at Keanu, his eyes wide with fear but also with a glimmer of trust. Keanu gave him a reassuring smile, one that spoke volumes more than words ever could. "You're safe now, Ethan," Keanu whispered, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but his voice steady, unwavering. And just as the man opened his mouth to argue, the unmistakable sound of sirens echoed from outside, growing louder with each passing second. The moment had arrived. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wail slicing through the tension in the room like a knife. It was a small, yet crucial moment, the shift from peril to potential safety, but the threat still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Keanu remained steady, his posture unshaken, as the man's hand twitched at his side. The storm was almost here, but it wasn't quite over yet. The man's eyes darted nervously to the door, his mind calculating, assessing. Keanu could see the panic just beneath the surface, the subtle shift in his stance as he realized that his grip on the situation was slipping. The child was no longer his to control, and something worse than confrontation was coming his way. The sirens were just the beginning. Keanu stood there, calm but ready, his body still blocking Ethan from the man's reach. The boy, though trembling, seemed to draw strength from Keanu's presence. His small hand tightened on Keanu's sleeve, a silent plea for safety, for rescue. But there was more than just fear in Ethan's eyes now. There was hope, a quiet, fragile hope. The man glared at Keanu, his eyes narrowing with mounting rage. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat, each word soaked in venom. "This doesn't end here." Keanu held the man's gaze, unwavering. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not with Ethan's safety on the line. His voice, when he spoke, was low but filled with authority. "This ends here, right now. You'll never lay a hand on him again." The man took a step back, his eyes flickering to the door as the sound of the approaching police cars grew deafening. He was calculating his next move, but Keanu had already outmaneuvered him. His options were running thin, and the mask of control he had so carefully crafted was beginning to crack. He was cornered, and the walls were closing in. The waitress, who had been standing at a distance, now shifted uneasily, looking between the two men, clearly uncomfortable but still unsure of what to do. She had seen enough to know something was terribly wrong, but the weight of what was unfolding in front of her was too much to process. She gave Keanu a fleeting glance, as if silently asking if there was anything she could do, but Keanu merely nodded in her direction, signaling that he had it under control. Then, just as the man took another step toward the door, the unmistakable thud of heavy footsteps outside echoed in the hallway. The door swung open with an almost cinematic precision, and two uniformed police officers entered the restaurant, their eyes scanning the room with purpose. They moved like sharks in water, their sharp gaze landing first on Keanu, then on the man who was clearly trying to leave, his face now flushed with anger and fear. "Sir," one of the officers spoke, his tone professional but firm. "We're going to need you to stay where you are." The man froze, his body stiffening, every muscle in his frame reacting as if the very idea of being challenged was foreign to him. The officers moved in closer, surrounding him in an almost predatory fashion, their presence demanding compliance. Keanu's eyes never left the man. "It's over," Keanu said, his voice carrying a weight that made the air around them feel heavy. "You're done here." For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. The air was thick with the aftermath of unspoken threats, the quiet tension that only those in immediate danger could truly feel. The man, realizing the net was closing, took another step back, but this time, he was met with the unyielding force of the law. "I told you." The man growled, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. "You have no idea who I am. You've made a mistake." Keanu watched him closely, his expression still calm, but now his eyes flickered with a hint of something else, something sharper. "I know exactly who you are," Keanu replied, his voice steady and unwavering. "And it's not just me you have to worry about." The officers, who had been patient up until this point, now exchanged a glance. The male officer took a step forward, his gaze locking onto the man. "You need to come with us, sir," he said, his voice now cold, no longer polite. "We've already got enough to take you in." The man's face twisted in frustration, but his escape route had vanished. He knew there was no getting out of this, not now. The officers moved quickly, their hands flashing to cuff him, and within moments, the man was on his knees, his wrists bound tight with the cold metal. Keanu stepped back slightly, allowing the officers to do their job, but his attention never wavered. His gaze fell back to Ethan, who was now visibly shaking but holding his ground beside him. Keanu gave the boy a small smile, the kind that meant everything was going to be okay, even if the world around them still seemed uncertain. The two officers led the man toward the door, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. The restaurant, once filled with the mundane noise of lunchtime chatter, now felt eerily quiet. Keanu stood there, steady as a rock, but his mind raced with what he had just witnessed. The danger wasn't over, not yet. They still had to make sure Ethan and his mother were safe. The police were handling the man, but Keanu knew they needed to move quickly. As the officers exited with the handcuffed man in tow, Keanu turned to the waitress, who had been watching everything unfold with wide eyes. "I need to get this boy to his mother," Keanu said, his voice calm, but urgent. "Can you get me some information? I need help now." The waitress, now fully aware of the situation's gravity, nodded quickly, her shock turning into action. "Of course," she said, pulling a notepad from her apron. She jotted something down and handed it to Keanu. "Address. The boy's mother, she's at home, but she's been hurt." Keanu took the slip of paper, his heart sinking with each word she said. He looked at Ethan, who was clinging to his side, eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in them now. A flicker of hope. "We'll get her help," Keanu reassured the boy softly, his grip gentle but firm. "I promise you, we'll get her help." With the sound of the man's arrest fading into the background, Keanu quickly ushered Ethan toward the door, the weight of the moment settling over him like a blanket. He didn't know what they would find when they arrived at the boy's home, but he was certain of one thing: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had a mother to save. And he wouldn't stop until she was safe. The ride to Ethan's house felt like an eternity, each passing second stretching into what seemed like hours. The sirens that had filled the air moments before were now a distant hum, fading into the background as Keanu focused on the boy beside him. Ethan's small hand remained gripped tightly in his body trembling but trying to stay composed. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the responsibility of protecting this child, of making sure they got to the boy's mother in time. The car seemed too quiet, the stillness between them only broken by Ethan's occasional sniffle. Keanu glanced down at the boy, trying to offer comfort in the midst of the storm. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Keanu squeezed his hand gently, offering a reassuring smile, though his mind was racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. When they arrived at the house, the street felt eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the neighborhood strangely absent. The car slowed as they neared the house, and Keanu's gaze swept over the exterior. It was a modest home, nothing extravagant, but it had an unsettling air about it now. The front door was slightly ajar, a subtle but unmistakable sign that something was wrong. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the sense of urgency flooding him. He turned to Ethan, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "Stay close, all right," he said softly, his voice steady despite the rising fear inside. Ethan nodded, his small frame pressed closer to Keanu as if drawing strength from his presence. The officers, still on high alert, had already started to move toward the house. Keanu followed closely behind, every step feeling heavier than the last. As they reached the front door, Officer Ramirez, the taller of the two officers, gently pushed it open, his gun drawn. The quiet creak of the door seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside, the chaos was immediately apparent. The living room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, the evidence of a struggle obvious in every corner. The floor was littered with broken objects, shards of glass, and signs of violence. The air felt thick, heavy with the remnants of panic and fear. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he surveyed the scene, his heart racing. "Sarah." Ethan's voice was small, barely a whisper, but it sent a wave of panic through Keanu. He immediately moved forward, pushing past the officers who were already surveying the area. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the boy's mother. And then, he saw her. Sarah was lying unconscious on the floor, a small pool of blood gathering around her head. Her face was pale, and her body lay still, the limpness of her form enough to send a cold shiver down Keanu's spine. He didn't hesitate for a moment. Kneeling down beside her, he checked for signs of life, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but there was no time to waste. "We need paramedics, now," he called to the officers, his voice urgent but steady. Ramirez immediately radioed for help, his eyes scanning the room with a sharp focus. As Keanu gently turned Sarah's head to make sure she wasn't obstructed in any way, he could see the bruises on her neck and arms, the signs of a struggle. His stomach turned. The man who had been with Ethan, Harris, had left more than just emotional scars. The physical damage was clear now, and the pain in Keanu's chest was palpable. But he couldn't afford to let that consume him. He had to focus. He had to get Sarah the help she needed. "Ethan," Keanu said softly, looking up at the boy who had been standing just behind him. Ethan's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't seem to want to leave his mother's side. Keanu reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "She's going to be okay. The paramedics are coming. We're going to make sure she's all right." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, his lip trembling as he nodded. He stepped forward slowly, his small hand brushing against his mother's as if trying to wake her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, wake up, please." The sound of his plea broke Keanu's heart. He couldn't imagine the pain the boy must have been feeling. The paramedics arrived moments later, their entrance swift but controlled. They moved efficiently, assessing Sarah's condition with practiced precision, immediately going to work to stabilize her. Keanu stepped back, allowing them space but never once leaving the boy's side. Ethan stood silently beside him, his small frame tense, his eyes fixed on his mother. The lead paramedic, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, turned to Keanu as they prepared to move Sarah. "She's stable for now, but she'll need to go to the hospital immediately. We'll take care of her from here." Keanu nodded, his gaze lingering on the paramedics as they worked. It felt like everything was happening so quickly, but the reality was that they had barely scratched the surface. The situation was still far from over. Harris was in custody, but the damage he'd done, the fear he'd instilled in Ethan and his mother, wasn't something that would disappear overnight. As the paramedics carefully lifted Sarah onto a stretcher, Keanu turned to Ethan. "You're coming with me," he said gently. "We'll go to the hospital, and we'll make sure your mom gets all the care she needs. You're not alone in this. Ethan nodded, his tears silently slipping down his face, but he held on to Keanu's words. Keanu could see the small flicker of relief in the boy's eyes, even though the fear still lingered there. The officers quickly followed them outside as the paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance. Keanu stayed close to Ethan, guiding him toward the vehicle. It felt surreal, the sense of urgency still weighing on him, but in this moment, he knew he was doing the right thing. He was there when Ethan needed him, and that was all that mattered. As the ambulance doors closed and it sped off toward the hospital, Keanu took a moment to glance back at the house, the chaos that had unfolded there still fresh in his mind. But the most important thing now was in that ambulance, heading toward safety. Keanu turned to Ethan, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "We're going to take care of everything. Don't worry." The boy looked up at him, his gaze full of gratitude, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Keanu allowed himself to believe that they might actually be okay. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the only sound coming from the steady hum of the ambulance engine and the faint beeping of the medical equipment. Keanu sat beside Ethan, who was still clutching his broken toy car in his small hands. The boy's eyes, though tired and red from crying, were fixed on the stretcher where his mother lay. The paramedics had done their best to stabilize her, but the uncertainty of what was to come weighed heavily on both of them. Keanu kept glancing at Ethan, who had fallen silent after his initial outburst, his small body trembling with the weight of the fear and pain he had carried for far too long. Keanu couldn't imagine the kind of courage it took for such a young boy to stand up, to speak out when his whole world was crumbling. He placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving him a comforting squeeze. "You're doing great, Ethan," Keanu said softly, trying to ease the tension that had been building in the boy's small frame. "You're really brave." Ethan didn't respond at first, his gaze still locked on his mother. But after a moment, he turned to Keanu, his eyes wide with a mixture of vulnerability and a strange sense of hope. "Is she going to be okay?" His voice was quiet, fragile, as though even speaking the question might break him further. Keanu didn't hesitate. "She's going to be all right, Ethan. The doctors will take good care of her. You did the right thing by asking for help." His voice was steady, reassuring, even though a part of him wasn't entirely sure if it was true. But the boy needed to hear it, needed to believe it. And for that, Keanu would offer every ounce of reassurance he could. As they arrived at the hospital, the flashing lights of the ambulance illuminated the night, casting long shadows on the pavement. Keanu helped Ethan out of the vehicle, keeping a protective hand on his back as they made their way into the emergency room. The staff was ready, already moving with practiced efficiency, guiding them toward a waiting area. They would have to wait until Sarah was stabilized, until the doctors could assess the full extent of her injuries. Keanu sat with Ethan in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room. It was a place that smelled of antiseptic and uncertainty, a place where time felt distorted, stretched, and endless. Ethan sat beside him, his tiny hands still gripping the toy car, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the doors where his mother had been taken. Keanu didn't speak much, the silence between them was thick with anticipation and unspoken fear. Keanu's thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the past few hours. It had all happened so fast, yet every moment felt like it was burned into his memory. The look on Ethan's face when he whispered about his mother's pain, the fear in his eyes as he clung to Keanu, the sound of Harris's voice, cold and menacing, as he tried to assert control. It was clear that this was only the beginning of a long road for Ethan and his mother, but Keanu couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. He'd always prided himself on his ability to stay out of the chaos, to remain an observer. But today, things had been different. There was something in Ethan's eyes, something in his vulnerability, that had called out to Keanu. He couldn't stand by and watch a child suffer. He had to act. And now, as he sat beside the boy in the sterile waiting room, he knew that whatever came next, he would continue to protect Ethan, to be there for him. Hours seemed to drag on. Keanu tried to stay calm, his mind drifting back to the message he had sent from the McDonald's, the police arriving just in time, the arrest of Harris. But the longer they waited, the more the weight of it all pressed on his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about what she had endured, about what would happen once she woke up. And Ethan. The boy had already been through so much, and it wasn't over yet. Finally, a doctor came into the room, her face tired but serious. Keanu stood up immediately, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, his voice low, a thread of tension running through it. The doctor gave him a small, reassuring nod. "She's stable for now. The injuries are serious, but we believe she'll recover with time. She'll need surgery to repair some of the damage, but she's strong. She's a fighter." Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief flooding through him like a wave. He turned to Ethan, who had been staring at the doctor, his face full of worry, his hands still tightly clutching the toy. "Your mom is going to be okay," Keanu said softly, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "She's going to make it, Ethan." The boy nodded, but Keanu could see the fear still in his eyes. It wasn't over yet. Not for either of them. The doctor continued, "She'll need to stay in the hospital for a while. We'll keep you informed, but for now, you should try to get some rest. She's in good hands." Keanu nodded, but his mind was already working, already thinking about the next steps. Ethan still needed care, still needed someone to guide him through the trauma, through the aftermath of what had happened. Keanu had the means, the resources to help, but it wasn't just about offering a place to stay. It was about being there, being the constant support that Ethan needed. As the doctor left, Keanu turned to Ethan, who was now sitting silently, his small face buried in his hands. The boy hadn't cried much, but Keanu knew that the Real storm was still brewing beneath the surface. "Ethan," Keanu said gently, kneeling down beside him, "you're not alone anymore. We're going to get through this, together." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with so many emotions Keanu could barely name. But there was one thing that stood out: trust. The boy trusted him. And in that moment, Keanu knew that he had to keep that trust intact, no matter what came next. The journey ahead was going to be difficult, long even, but for Ethan, for Sarah, Keanu was going to stand by them every step of the way. This was no longer just a fleeting moment of compassion. This was a commitment. As they sat there in the quiet of the waiting room, Keanu felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This was his fight now, too. And he wasn't going to let either of them face it alone.